Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for being here for this very special History Revealed with Chad Montrie and James Curry. We're so excited to be able to bring both of them back. They've done History Revealed programs for us previously, and we're really looking forward to tonight's program. So I want to thank the East Side Freedom Library for tonight for hosting our speakers, as well as for their support going on for 5 or 6 years now, as well as the Ramsey County Library System as our other partner. I also want to mention Subtext Books is our bookstore partner. So you may buy this title or any of the other titles for our History Revealed programs at Subtext Books, which is in downtown St. Paul. A couple people are having troubles hearing, so if you can't hear me, then you might need to sign in and make sure that your microphones are on. But I want to ask everybody to keep your cameras and microphones turned off during the program so that we don't get interference and so forth. The program is being recorded and it'll be up on our YouTube channels probably the first part of next week. So I want to thank everybody who supports Ramsey County Historical Society and the East Side Freedom Library. These programs would not be possible without your support, and you get a lot of great benefits, including our quarterly magazine, Ramsey County History. And you can find out more about RCHS on our website, which is www.rchs.com, which is up on your screen, as well as the link to the East Side Freedom Libraries, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. We are committed to presenting the stories and histories of all in our community, and to that end, we're pleased to bring you tonight's program. But we'd also like to acknowledge this sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Makoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful history and current challenges facing the Dakota people, just as we celebrate the contributions of Dakota and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's rchs.com, which includes actionable ways in which we pledge to honor the Dakota and other indigenous peoples of Minnesota Makoche. I want to remind everybody that if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. And Clarence over at the East Side Freedom Library will be monitoring that, and he will relay your questions to Chad and James. So again, you should have access to the chat for that. So again, thank you all for being here, and I want to turn it over to Clarence White at the East Side Freedom Library. Thank you, everyone.
Joining us. We're here at the East Side Freedom Library. Thank you for joining us from wherever you are. My name is Clarence White. I'm the Associate Director here at the East Side Freedom Library, and we are thrilled not only that you've joined us, but to have these two esteemed guests with us. Again, I want to thank every co-sponsor. Of course, our usual sponsors, the Ramsey County Libraries, Ramsey County Historical Society, and for this special event, the Friends of the University of Minnesota Libraries. So thank you. We appreciate all of that. I want to probably reiterate, I have not been able to hear Robin's portion of this given our technology setup, but you can put questions in the chat that start the addition to the chat with the letter Q, so we know it's a question. This is a very popular event. We have a lot of folks here tonight. I don't know that we'll be able to get to all of the questions, but we appreciate you contributing to the event in that way. So I'm just going to begin by introducing our guest this evening. First, James Curry, who is a producer, director, writer, editor, educator, and author who has been active in filmmaking for over 30 years. His short film, Westbound, and documentary, Master Jam, have won dozens of awards internationally in multiple categories. In 2021, he was awarded the Jerome Hill Artist Fellowship for Film, and in 2022, the MacArthur C. McWatt Fellowship, where he was able to pursue social justice through the creation of a historical exhibit on Black pioneers and the June release of a graphic novel based on his ancestors' narrative called Hate Springs. Stings, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. He is a descendant of the Curry family of South Side Minneapolis and the chairperson of br4r.org. He teaches film and production at Augsburg University and continues to build community through partnerships with historical societies, individuals and faith-based organizations. He's presently involved in the development of a Black Heritage Trail in Hastings, a people power exhibit at the Minnesota African American Heritage Museum and Gallery, one of our partners at the Eastside Freedom Library, and a couple of projects in September, and a volume series on sung and unsung Black Minnesotan luminaries with the Minnesota Historical Society, slated for a 2026 semi-quincentennial release.
You got it. Yeah, well done.
It's a mouthful. And no, thank you. And further to my right, Chad Montrie is a professor in history in the history department at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. He is the author of 4 books and has published 5 books, including Whiteness in Plain View, The History for Racial Exclusion in Minnesota, which he presented here earlier this year, I believe, or last.
First time was 2022.
Yes, 2022, last year, and was part of this series. And also The Myth of Silent Spring, Rethinking the Origins of American Environmentalism. This past year, he was a Fulbright Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary, based in the history department and affiliated with the Calgary Institute for the Humanities. So I welcome these two to our event. But before we get started, both Chad and I were at the History Center earlier today for a gathering of teachers called History Fest. And one of the teachers shared something from Chad's book, Whiteness in Plain View. And I wanted to read that because I thought it was so instructive about the importance of how we are teaching history and sharing these stories with multiple generations. He wrote, Dr. Montrie's book, Whiteness in Plain View, is a great look into the counter narrative surrounding racism in the history of the North. It is very commonly taught that the North was a safe place for racial minorities due to its lack of de jure racism. This narrative, however, doesn't account for the history of de facto racism in the North, which is especially highlighted through this book. The chapter we read in class regarding Duluth and the struggles of the Carter family and their search for home ownership is a very good example of how individual stories can highlight what textbooks broadly covering a span of 10 to 20 years cannot. This method of focusing on the individuals helps illustrate this idea of a counter narrative, which makes Whiteness in Plain View so important. And that's Timothy Spriggs in West Mankato, a high school student. So thank you both for spreading your message around. And with that, I am going to hand this conversation over to the two of you. So thanks for being here.
Thank you. Thank you. So the way that we decided to work this out as far as a program initially is I'm going to say a few things sort of about the book, but not too much, and then sort of turn it over to James, and he'll say a few things about the work he's engaged in too. We might ask each other a few questions, and then we'll do that as efficiently as we can, and move on to anything that you'd like to offer from the virtual sphere as far as comments or observations or questions. I also want to thank some people for putting this together, some of whom you already heard referenced, particularly Robin Priestley at the Ramsey County Historical Society, Peter Reckliff here at the Eastside Freedom Library, and also Clarence and Bailey, who are here with us, and everyone else who's been involved in sort of getting this together. As Clarence said, I had actually did the original book launch for Whiteness in Plain View here at the Eastside Freedom Library when it came out in April 2022, and I've done other talks. Take this out. And I've done other talks about the book, and so some of you, in fact, may have even attended one of those, or you've watched one of the recordings of the talks, and you know that means I don't think I'm at this point really it's not necessary or even maybe that productive to go through sort of any of the details or any of the specific examples, but I will for people that haven't seen the book or maybe don't know that much about it. I'll just sort of say a few things. Mainly what the book is meant to do is show how white people in towns and cities and suburbs across the state of Minnesota acted to intimidate, control, remove, and keep out Black residents from their communities. But this evening, what we decided to do is focus on the aspect of historical memory and how stories that white people told and still tell themselves today allow them or were part of sort of their process of forgetting and misremembering, and in some cases justifying racial exclusion and other manifestations of racism. When I first started doing the archival research and then moved on to the writing of the book, trying to put that research into some kind of form, I was kind of in disbelief myself as a white person that something so fundamental to Minnesota's history could be so effectively hidden. There's really an imbalance between that, I think, in terms of how obvious the history of racial exclusion is if you look at any of the sources, and just also how profoundly white people have managed to, as I said, forget or misremember this past. And I realized that in addition, in a sense, to the specific methods that we often talk about that whites use to do racial exclusion, violence, relying on realtors and realtor deceit to sort of avoid having African Americans rent apartments or buy houses, racial restrictive covenants, redlining. That also this thing of historical memory and sort of the decade after decade of misremembering and forgetting, that's also a tool of racial exclusion, that's playing a part in this process, and it remains operative today in terms of perpetuating racism. And I want to just read a little bit of the introduction to illustrate this or to say something more about it. This is from page 2 in the book. What whites did was not a lapse or aberration, an isolated flare of hatred in a single place, or a minor blemish on a largely clean record of welcome and acceptance. It was conventional and common, and the efforts at exclusion enjoyed shifting legal license from decade to decade. Additionally, the all-white communities that resulted became their own justification and propagating agent, demonstrating to whites that Blacks wanted to live only among their own race, confirming to whites that African Americans did not have the economic means to integrate, and supporting the notion among whites that Blacks' supposed racial failings must be what kept them out. I'll also end the book with something along these lines in the epilogue. This is from page 203. Concurrent with affecting exclusive whiteness in cities, towns, and suburbs, Minnesota whites also adopted an historical amnesia, which opportunely made them oblivious to how exclusion came to be. They fashioned spurious explanations for the overwhelming whiteness in their daily lives, as well as fictions that absolve them of responsibility for correcting the recurring monumental injustice. The vacuous memory and false discernment were another important part of preserving and perpetuating racial exclusion, keeping the reality of it paradoxically hidden in plain view. Although it can do nothing to change the actual past, whiteness in plain view is meant to be a counterpoint to this misremembering and misrepresentation, to expose what Minnesota whites have supposedly forgotten or cunningly occluded. Other manifestations in other places have been or need to be methodically chronicled and interpreted too. The expanded historical consciousness that will come from this endeavor is an essential part of a larger collective struggle. In fact, I would argue that this is the kind of thing that what I just sort of suggested or sort of alluded to, and what we're going to get into more deeply tonight as you hear from James and as he and I talk with one another, and I think also in the Q&A, that this is really what's bothering the white reactionaries in our current moment, who are leading a new censorship movement. Their aim is to whitewash school curriculums across the country, or to do that more effectively, because in many cases, the curriculums are already somewhat whitewashed in terms of the way that they talk about race. Ostensibly, of course, they mention or refer to critical race theory, but I don't think, teachers generally are offering critical race theory as part of their curriculums. What they're doing, I think, is using critical race theory as a phrase to bring the word theory into the conversation, and employing the popular understanding that theory is something unproven and debatable, and so it's not really legitimate for presenting it to young students as something that's true. But what they really are afraid of is the kind of thing that you find in the book Whiteness, but also in many other things that people are writing and publishing and sort of putting into other forms. And that's sort of historical facts, right? Historical facts that are based on the kind of research that historians do, where we go out and we find sources. We have evidence to say what we're saying. We have evidence to make the kind of arguments that we're making. And that's much more difficult for these reactionaries to contest. If they don't have the resources, if they lack the sources, if they lack the evidence to do that, then what that means is they're going to be losing control of the narrative. And that's what's going on. We're fighting over the narrative. We're fighting over what story gets told. And in a sense also, though, we're fighting over why someone has the right to tell that story, or to be the ones who are crafting the narrative that shows up in school books and curriculums and elsewhere. Once we recover what happened in places like Austin, Duluth, Edina, Rondo, and elsewhere, including, as James, I think, will talk about, in Hastings, we have a clear choice. We're either on the side of white supremacy, with all of that entails, or on the side of the movement to end and undo racism's multifaceted legacy. So I'm going to end my comments there and let James make his comments, and then I think maybe we might shift into me asking him a few questions after that.
Thanks, Chad. Let's see. Yeah, I came at this from a personal standpoint after the completion of a documentary that was personal and family oriented. It touched on the larger history of my ancestors and their roots in Hastings. So I pursued in a cursory way, just getting to know the city of Hastings and folks there. Actually, I was responding to an email that they wanted to unearth and excavate and share the story. In fact, they had tied a narrative together through the Hastings Gazette and did a spoken word, for lack of a better term, a play based on that narrative, which enlightened some of the residents of Hastings. But once they found a descendant, myself, and I went down there and explored. I actually didn't know about the AME church burning. I don't recall my dad sharing that with me, but I knew that we had plots there, and the great grandpa and great aunts and great uncles were buried there. So when the McWatt Fellowship came through, I decided to pursue connecting. Oh, okay. I decided to pursue connecting other stories of Black activists in Hastings, and that resulted in my forming a nonprofit, a 501c3 BR4R, whose mission is to share this history with. First, we were getting buy-in with the town, but eventually we'd like to share it with everybody. There's a Minopedia article on the burning of Brown's Chapel. So, and then I ran into Chad, and Dr. James Lowen was a guest, and it's sort of this. I'm a lay historian, but it's fallen into my lap, and the exploration of it is extremely enlightening. And being a filmmaker, I channeled it into a narrative that I thought I could tap into the hometown illustrator, Tom Nguyen, who's done DC and Marvel comics, and make sort of maybe even a trilogy out of this, but first, this proof of concept Hate Stings comic book is what was the result of that McWatt Fellowship. And yeah, that's about it. We're looking for members for BR4R, by the way, board members or members. So br4r.org if you'd like to find out more.
So I think that's actually a really nice segue to what I wanted to start off with in terms of asking you questions. So when I first started doing the research for Whiteness in Plain View, I was imagining as an academic that I might be able to try to shift over to other ways of bringing my research to an audience, right? And you know, I was not just as interested anymore just talking to academics. And I had a friend who's a documentary filmmaker, and I thought, hey, maybe we could do something like a doc. And so we actually came to Edina, and we went to Austin, and we did some interviews. We did some sample reel footage. And then I went back, and what I realized is like this would be very difficult. So I very much respect what goes into documentary filmmaking. And you know, what I decided, as you see, is that at a certain point I decided I couldn't make a documentary film about this, that I had to write a book because that's what I know how to do. So I want to talk to you about how you will go about telling the story of racial exclusion as a documentary filmmaker. So I can just sort of tell you the
Sure.
question I wrote out here. As a doc filmmaker and scriptwriter for a comic, what would you say are the main challenges to making the history of racism accessible to a wide audience? How do you work with those challenges?
Yeah, well, in some respects, you're engaging in a lot of hypotheticals of what I immediately think of dialogue. Since I don't know the dialogue of how often the N-word was used in the South, or if folks' education level, whether they were speaking, kind of a pidgin English, so it's a lot of speculation. But therein lies that whole poetic license or dramatic license to sort of just go with your gut and your instincts. But I tried my best to base things on fact. I mean, you can go to papers from the 1800s and see the words that are getting tossed around. And this isn't all about finding dialogue, but I was trying to pin myself to that era, which is difficult, but yeah, it's it's a little bit just conjecture but based on fact as much as you can. But yeah, at some point you've just got to go with your gut and what feels right emotionally. Then I think you can get past all the some of the granular details and just a scene should have sort of an arc, and if it starts out negative, you can either end it positive or another negative. And so I just applied a lot of regular screenplay tools to make the scene work as a scene. Yeah.
So I was really moved by your documentary about your brother, Master Jam, which is, obviously a sort of a family story. And I know part of what you're doing in terms of how you're going to tell the Hastings story, or how you're envisioning it, will be essentially partly at least a family story, personal. What makes family and personal history appealing and effective for examining the history of racism in Minnesota and the United States in general? How is your own family and personal history unique, and what about it is common?
Well, I thought of Alex Haley and Roots, and the fact that you could that what made Roots powerful is that you did have a family to follow, and cousins, and an extended family, which acted as supporting characters. So that seemed like the proper vehicle, a family that had subplots and marriages that created extended families. And it's a little bit convoluted, but I think following I mean, that goes back to literature where you're just following a family or a multi-character through a multi-character story. What is unique about my family? I thought it was a microcosm of a macro story where you're, slaves or fugitive slaves or former slaves making their way to the north, small town, which is the story of a lot. Hastings is just one of many small towns where Blacks found, the ability to either build their own homes or the opportunity to build their own homes, become multifaceted laborers, barbers, what have you, to put bread on the table. And then I don't know if it was, living by rivers, if that tied into the idea of access and maybe even the Underground Railroad so that you could go further north, or just another version of a highway, I suppose. And then I didn't anticipate that every Black family has their offspring leave the small town for better opportunities, which happened in the Curry family, where there was Tuskegee and there was Hampton Institute and World War I. So it was just way too rich to pass on. And I began tying other stories of my grandmother being a Black Rosie in World War II over in Arden Hills, and so it was kind of quintessentially Minneapolis and Northern, and I can just recall I just have resources to access, whether they live in my head or on paper, to flesh that story out as best as I can, and brothers that can help me out. Yeah.
So maybe we want to do any, take some comments or observation from the chat or questions. Can keep going. Okay, so oh, you're asking that now. Okay, so well, I do have another. So as I've been doing book talks since the book came out, I've often mentioned the work that's going on in Hastings. Like I was fortunate to come into, for us to find one another, and also for me to get to know Heidi. And I don't know if you want to say a little bit more about the building Remembrance for Reconciliation, because people will often ask me, when I get done talking, oh, well, what can we do, right?
Totally.
And I do want people to be able to feel empowered to do something, and not
Totally.
just to sort of make them feel disempowered. So if you want to talk more about BR4R.
So it was a pre-George Floyd get together. So this wasn't really kind of a reactionary whites wanting to do good or join the reckoning and read, White Fragility and the other book, which escapes me. So in other words, instead of forming book clubs, this was happening in 2017. In fact, I think Rich Mankey, it was in response to Trump's election, and he was the director of the Lakeside Cemetery in Hastings, and was covering was interested in who was buried in the Potter's Field, and he knew that there were unmarked graves from Black Civil War veterans and their wives and their children. And then the reaching out to me, so there was maybe 8 individuals, including myself, that decided to form a 501c3. Then George Floyd happened, then COVID happened. So it became this Zoom conversations, which people were having. We weren't diving super deep into race relations, but it was the topic. But it was more about sharing this history that we know of, because people wanted. It was documented in the burning of the church, and ultimately we were looking for commemoration and memorialization of that from the city. So held events, breaking the silence, brought in authors like yourself, James Lowen and Shaletta Bundridge came out for the first Juneteenth, or I'm sorry, the first celebration of Black History Month that we know of in Hastings. And so I think we've done this kind of interesting work as a nonprofit of sharing history, uncomfortable history, having focus groups, bringing in authors, just kind of being the first to do what others would like to do or think of, and getting response and buy-in and allies and serving soul food that they'd never had, and it's kind of neat. It's kind of a silver-haired audience in Hastings, but even that in itself is fruitful because you get the feedback, and it's rich, but it's ready to go into a new phase and go beyond Dakota County, I think. So that's something, that's something concrete. There's action steps where you can have events, you can excavate history, you can find descendants, you can, Dr. Ernest Lloyd, came to he came to our Juneteenth held there, and yeah, it's community and fellowship and food.
Yeah, we do have a question. It's asking if you can tell us more about the church fire.
I can send you to Minipedia. I hate it when people do that to me, but sure. Founded by James Wallace, John Wallace, James Curry, and their wives, Phoebe Ella Curry and Nancy Wallace. There was a number of AMEs in Minnesota, African Methodist Episcopal, which comes out of Philadelphia. J.C. Anderson out of Iowa was an AME pastor that would put together churches. There was a German Baptist church that was available in 1892 in Hastings. They needed $200 for a down payment, solicited subscriptions, that's what they were called, from the town. Prescott, a gentleman in Prescott gave $50, a black gentleman. There was this sort of alliance between Trimble, Point Douglas, Prescott, and Hastings, little pockets of black community, probably in the 20s numbers. The numbers are in 20s and 30s population wise. They were able to build this, they were able to put a down payment on this church. Had a fantastic opening, written up in the Spokesman, a black female pastor, very successful, weddings, funerals, so a profitable church for activism as well as just fellowship. Lasted 15 years into 1907, probably 2 weeks after their 15th anniversary, around Halloween. The papers differ on the day. There was evidence was found of a sash being lifted, kerosene residue on the pews and walls and floors. Yeah, it was arsonists or incendiaries, which is what they called them. It was put out. It had no foundation. It had no insurance. So the Brown's Chapel AME was engulfed in flames around Halloween 1907. And the church, the town, there's no sort of investigation. There's just the two notices of the burning, and the fact that it was put out quickly, and the fact that it was arson. Then black residents had to go to a former church, Methodist church, which actually in the 20s had a Klan chaplain as their pastor, or I guess, yeah, pastor. So yeah, that's kind of the short and sweet story of the destruction of Brown's Chapel. I'm sure it was beyond heartbreaking. You know, it was more than just a church. It was probably, it was a center for their community. And uh, there's hints of, it being boys or teens involved, but the complicity of silence from the town afterwards that had tolerated or bought in and was comfortable with it, but they started getting, it started to become a destination for Blacks from the Twin Cities to come to Hastings. And it was probably that numbers game of like, not only were they excelling and becoming successful, but the town was getting browner. And maybe these folks might start looking for homes. So the town just kept quiet about it and there was no investigation. And it was referred to in the 40s in the paper, and the town became basically all white by 54. The last Black man died. And their numbers never reached the Black population numbers until the 90s. Started getting 20, 30 folks. If you want to visit Dakota County Loshie Museum, there's a whole timeline based on the African-American community there.
Yeah, thanks. You used, I think this is the term you used, conspiracy of silence. Is that what?
Or complicity.
Complicity. And in the History Fest today, there was more than one mention of this like complicity of forgetting. And I guess I'll combine a couple of questions here. James, you work in several media. Chad, I primarily work as a scholar and author. But how does that help you tell these stories, and how important are the different media to the practice of conveying these stories, and how things can get remembered, especially in an environment of intentional forgetting, which is particularly American.
Well, as I kind of alluded to, and as sort of came up today at History Fest and has come up in other talks that I've done, my book is sort of on the line between what we might call sort of academic scholarship and something for a general audience. I'm probably not yet like at my best in terms of writing for a general audience. I'm still sort of too much the grad student historian, but I have a hard time not packing all the details in there, but I find the archives are so rich in terms of this history. It's really hard not to tell. And I guess what I do is I feel compelled to keep those details there. Like, because as I said, like, I think this is we're in a struggle over a narrative, and I want it to be clear that there is evidence. I'm not writing fiction. I'm not making anything up. I'm just telling you what I found, that, you can contest it. Maybe there's other evidence that might lead us to tell a story in a slightly different way. But what I'm finding is things that really happened, and individuals with names, and in communities that we can point to. Some of these people still alive, or at least maybe have descendants who are alive. And I think that has been helpful from what I can tell in terms of people having, especially white people, having sort of an epiphany and feeling sort of thankful that this is now down on paper. They can read it, they can share it, and it can be part of a ongoing conversation, including the kind that they're having in Hastings. But I do think there's limitations to it, right? And even though you read this quote from this student who's really, like, I think impacted by having this book be part of their course, there's limitations to the kind of book that I write. And so that's why I really admire the kind of work that James does. So maybe you want to talk a little bit more about how there's different kinds of media that reach different audiences, or the same audience, but in different ways.
Yeah, and that, let's see, John Lewis's March, I've heard time and time again that's sort of the go-to text for the civil rights, which you'd think why would you think a graphic novel would connect with young adults, but that's what works. So that's tied directly to visuals. And when the idea was proposed that some of this narrative could be shared through visuals, it was daunting to think of like, okay, now I've got to write a novel. But instead, this was more of a tease, and it was kind of origin story based, but again, based in fact and oral history. So yeah, I kind of leaned on visuals. Luckily, I think that's my forte. And I had a collaborator that was great at sort of editing those visuals when I was adding too much dialogue and letting the visual speak for itself, which is just a standard screenplay rule of less is more, and let the picture speak for itself. So yeah, it's always cool when you've got papers. In this case, regarding Brown's Chapel, there's a great picture. Gillian Knight found a picture in the Spokesman or Recorder back in the 1900s of L.A. Reagan, the female preacher, at Brown's Chapel AME. So it's we had photography, so a lot of these papers included depictions. There's a famous, not a famous, but the only picture of the Black community in Hastings is their congregation in front of Brown's AME, and it's very iconic to me and emblematic of the folks. And I'm really thankful for newspapers, Black and white newspapers that had the foresight to include at the time, these photos that we now take for granted as visual driven newspaper.
So I know both of you are using some primary sources and other scholarship and just stories. As we are continuing this conversation, what are some places that you think people can look to grab onto some of these stories? Of course, the work that both of you do is great, but of course, there's more to find out from our own families, from the people that we live around, and especially from the people who we have been separated from or segregated from. I don't know if you have any suggestions on where to look, and maybe not just in our research, but in our everyday life as we walk through the spaces we walk in and wonder why they look the way they look, both economically, architecturally, city planning, etc.
That's a big one. But I immediately thought of family photo albums and shutterbugs in the extended family. I'm so thankful for those relatives that did bust out the camera, and how the curators of photo albums that have been passed down. I consider myself one of those because I just, by being the baby in the family, I think you're the last one, and it kind of trickles down. So yeah, besides papers, I'm so thankful for actual, the oral histories, the retaining of what Pop said and what Mom said about situations, as well as being able to connect that to like the photos in the family album, or find that cousin that said they had a photo of something in a trunk and that came from an aunt. So I don't mind going down those roads, which I've done. It's great, but it's a bit of a treasure hunt when you hear that there's photos and tracking down those cousins. But that's a reason to reconnect, and that's all good in my opinion. I can't really speak to the architectural or space part of that, but I just wanted to put that out there about the value of family photos.
Yeah, and I think it would add to that, that there's many things, but maybe two examples for people to think about, especially now that we're all used to doing things virtually as we're doing tonight. You have maybe more experience sort of being at home and working at things from your computer. One resource that I used a lot for my book, which you could use yourself for your own community or to expand on things that I happen to say about a community in the book that you are a part of, is ancestry.com, or there's other ways to get access to the census manuscripts, but ancestry.com is one way. I think that is like really one of the most important records for watching a area in a town or a city change over time. If you look at the census manuscript, for people that don't know, it's the paper form that a census taker was using as they walked around a place and they asked a question to the person in the household: how many people are here, what's their name, what's their age. And the census form also changed over time in terms of the other questions they'd ask, but they usually always included race, although they changed the way they refer to race over time. They'll talk about occupation, what language they speak, if they're an immigrant, where they're from, when they immigrated. And you can layer these on top of one another. You can go back to the 1870s and look at the ones all the way up to the 20th century. And in fact, we just opened the census manuscript. Well, I didn't do it, but the federal government opened the manuscript census for 1950, right? And I wish that was open when I was doing this book, because there are things in that 1950 census manuscript that I wanted to know, and that I could have, would have aided me in telling some stories. But you can do this as sort of part of lay history on your own. If you're doing something like the Building Remembrance for Reconciliation in your own community, having those conversations, relying on the census manuscripts could be good, toward that end. So get yourself a subscription to ancestry.com.
And with that comes newspapers.com, does it not?
Right. But then also, I was going to say the other thing is the Minnesota History Center has, if you go on their website, you can access many digitized Minnesota newspapers that go back into the 19th century, or through ancestry.com. But I often will go there. Right now, what I'm doing is some research on Duluth for my next book. And I've been reading the Duluth Herald day by day through 1921. I will do that all the way up to the 1950s. You can do that too, and you will see manifestations of racism all over the place, and that will also help you sort of fill in the gaps. And I think part of what's going on here too is, like, James and I are talking about some of the things that if together there's a confluence, right? Like, if you find a photograph, you still need to put that photograph in context. We still need to know what this blackface minstrel show photograph is doing, right, in the 1950s. On the other hand, if I just tell the story about a blackface minstrel show at a high school and you don't see that shocking, horrific picture, then there's a way that picture adds something to the reality of the event, right? And especially if you see many of them.
Great. America is the land of forgetting. I think about that, but we have a question here that asks, how is memory erased or edited? How is amnesia produced? How does that work? I mean, we have so much of it here. I mean, our memories here in this culture last about, by the time the next election rolls around, we've forgotten. How does that work? Maybe that's just one way, but what are some of the mechanisms we use?
I was just going to say, in terms of crime and trauma, I think it's a natural tendency to submerge and erase in a personal way. And then you've got time on your side to help make that salve or balm come to life, or it perpetuates it. But yeah, I couldn't answer why the amnesia kicks in for over negative consequences or just turning a blind eye. Yeah, no.
Well, one of the reasons why I wrote this book about Minnesota, why it's about Minnesota, is because I wanted to well, really the main reason is I wanted to talk about racism in the North. I grew up in Kentucky, consider myself sort of, born of the Mid-South, or sort of grew up in the Mid-South. And what I knew about the history of racism was mostly about the South, right? And I knew that that was limited, and that when I shifted in terms of my research over to doing something about race in America, I wanted to talk about this other dimension, right? And what I found, though, is that there's a reason why why that sort of was underdeveloped as an area or a field or conversation, and it has to do with how people also who were living in the past were misremembering and forgetting the past. So when I found in Minnesota, when you look at various historical records, including newspapers, there are many white Northerners who are saying, including, like, for instance, when the lynching happens in Duluth, people are shocked that this happened in Duluth, right? Or people are shocked when there's some other racist violence, or when they have evidence of housing discrimination occurring in their neighborhood, because they've been telling a story to themselves about how it won't happen in the North, right? Or they're using the South as a foil. There may be even many people who claim to be very liberal sort of advocates of Black civil rights, and what they know is the segregation that's happening in Alabama, or they're following the bus boycotts, or they're following sit-in demonstrations at lunch counters, and they're celebrating the fact that they're aware and engaged with that. Meanwhile, not noticing what really was taking place in their own cities or towns, and in fact using it as oftentimes as a filler to avoid having to acknowledge what's going on. So, for instance, in Austin, which is a mostly all-white city by the time we get to the mid-20th century, as a result of earlier racist violence, with Blacks being run out of town by whites in 1922. By the 1960s, there are people in Austin who start an Austin Human Rights Committee, and when the State Commission Against Discrimination sends an official down to Austin to talk to them and say, look, this is what we'd like you to be working on, they tell her, well, we don't really have a race problem here, because there's only 2 Black families and they don't have any problem finding housing. And that's an unawareness that's it's really just like, I mean, it's just astounding, right? And sort of there's something very deep going on there when those two really, I think, sincerely, engaged white liberal people say there's no problem here, that the problem is probably religious discrimination or conflict, that they're not noticing the whiteness around them. And that's why the title of the book is Whiteness in Plain View. And sometimes it's like that. It's not this very obvious thing where white people say, we're going to forget about this thing and not remember it, and don't talk about it to the kids or whatever. It's like this other way that they sort of convince themselves into a very different understanding of the past, right?
It just sounds like the Sugar Bowl effect in a way. The whiteness that you're surrounded compounds or only sort of enables that amnesia to a certain extent.
Yeah, and I know in the book you talk more about Chad. You talk more about the what actually happened in Austin and how it got to be just 2 Black families. We have another question. Will you talk a bit more about the use of oral stories as first-person information that can help document the complexity of racism in Minnesota? So, finding oral histories.
And again, I can only speak from a personal standpoint, but yeah, I mean, I think I could probably ask you this as a historian. There's this lack of credence to a lot of oral history, and over time or traditionally, and yet the Black experience is so heavily based in oral history, and there seems to be a snobbery about well, if it's not written, but if I'm not mistaken, Roots, Alex Haley, yes, I know that there was some litigation involving a little bit of plagiarism, but heavily based on oral history, if not solely. So yeah, I mean, if one can get over the fact that they're not going to have to defend this history in front of an academic, then or an audience, or then embrace that oral history as fact. You can then get second cousins and other family members to sort of second it as a secondary resource. But you know, luckily I was engaged in a dramatic historical fictionalization where I wasn't held, my feet weren't held to the fire over whether something was a fact or not.
Yeah, I mean, there are problems with oral history, but we know there are. And so you just, as an historian or as a filmmaker or whatever, you just have to be careful with the way you use them. And I mean, and one of them is that people who are doing oral, when they do an interview, we're not there at the moment, right? So this is kind of a primary source, but it's not exactly, because what they're doing is telling you their memory. And as we just said, like, memory can be faulty. Sometimes that's what you want to know. Like, if I never correct somebody if I'm interviewing them myself, when I think they've said something that is erroneous or that isn't true, because sometimes they're mistelling the events. It's like white people misremembering what happened in some place in the 1930s. That's actually going to be part of the story, is the fact that they remember it that way. Interestingly, set it against something else, and then you see something else taking place in terms of the history of memory, right? How memory changes over time, or how memory is not the same across, you know, different races or class, whatever. But Black Oral History Project that was done in Minnesota, though, is really helpful for me in many ways in different chapters, including in Duluth. There's a public accommodations legislation that's supposed to ban discrimination in public spaces at the end of the 19th century, that comes out of a case in Duluth. And, you know, people would say, if they look at that and look at like newspapers or other records, they would think, okay, that was settled there and there was no discrimination in public spaces after that. But if you look at the Black Oral History Project, you see person after person after person saying, oh, you knew that there were certain restaurants you couldn't go to. There were places in movie theaters you couldn't sit. There was jobs that you knew you weren't going to go try to interview for or put an application in for because they weren't going to hire you anyway. That's in those oral history interviews, and it's not anywhere else. And maybe there are things, maybe we need to make sure that we're not just relying on them exclusively, and maybe you know, sometimes we want to make sure that we're going to sort of corroborate them with something else. But I wouldn't have been able to tell that part of Duluth's history, that there's actual segregation going on in Duluth into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, unless I had the Black Oral History Project interviews that people did in the 70s.
Thank you. Another question for Chad. Says, I know you've written about racial exclusion in Minnesota as well as American environmentalism. Can you talk about what you've learned in your research about the relationship between racial and environmental inequities, specifically in Minnesota?
Well, actually, I don't know really much at all about how the connections in Minnesota, but the book actually, in a way, so I mean, I did train as an environmental labor historian, and what I mostly was doing for about a decade and a half after I got out of grad school was working on trying to retell the American environmental movement by pointing out the role that workers and organized labor played in bringing about environmental consciousness in the country, and sort of moving that story back in time into the early 20th century at least. And not just relying on sort of that, you know, the Rachel Carson Silent Spring book that's published in 1962 as the beginning date. When I was done with graduate school, I went to Memphis, Tennessee to do a postdoc, and I was in a neighborhood in Memphis that I knew had a history of people of color being exposed to environmental hazardous waste, and I did an article about how segregation then, you know, was implicated in that the segregation that's taking place in those neighborhoods, the Valentine Evergreen neighborhoods, was one story, and then there's sort of the environmental story, but I sort of brought those two together in the article, and other people were doing that too at the time and have since done, you know, a lot more work on it. But I think there is a lot there. And I think we're really just starting to see I think we're starting to see sort of that mature. There are several books out now about places like Detroit and other parts of the United States where you have a lot of industrialization and you have racial division, racial segregation, and environmental hazards, and people sort of drawing the lines or connecting the dots between that history. But I don't really know anything about that from Minnesota, so I can't really speak to that.
Okay. Where can one find the film about Black life in Hastings? Is there?
That film does not yet exist. I've been heavily involved or a little bit torn between a number of projects, which feels like a lot of pre-production. The documentary I did prior, the two prior documentaries involved were totally guerrilla style, and I was using myself and my family as sources, so it didn't require a whole lot of research except internal interviews. So this is a larger story that I've yet to have the time with, nor have the time and energy or a team to move it along. But it's you know, docs can sometimes just be 10-year projects, but for now there's the article. So yeah,
Well, you think about how long it took for Summer of Soul
totally,
to reach distribution. So
totally.
I get that.
If there are any wealthy donors out there, are you asking them to email you or get in touch to help fund the project?
Yeah, McKnight, Jerome, MRAC, anybody, or yeah, I'd like to, in a way, I can get lost in pre-production because that's where the excavation of more and more stories comes, and you can sort of prioritize. So I'm pretty engaged with the comic idea of and this exhibit on the people power movements of AIM and the Way in Minnesota, and the Brown Berets. Yeah, I'm sort of in the thick of it. If someone wants to fund my pre-production, that'd be great. But otherwise it'll just chug along at the pace that I'm able to maintain.
Okay, good. Another story or another question for James Curry. Given your long roots in Black community spaces in Minnesota, who are some of the unsung Minnesotan luminaries that you wish more people knew about?
Well, that's neat.
The complete list, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, and see, I'm not, well, I mean, you know, I don't think I didn't know about Jimmy Lee or Deborah Montgomery. Katie McWatt, her maiden name is Curry, so she's a cousin. So I knew of Katie, and you know, Alan Page and Cap Wigington, but I wasn't finding these until I was in my 30s or my 40s, and it was, you know, scattered resources, and kind of the division between Minneapolis and St. Paul. I haven't even touched on Minneapolis luminaries, but yeah, it just brought to mind the idea of being able for a junior high school student or elementary student being able to grab a book and, like we've seen, you know, kind of the talented 10th, page after page, and yet something like that doesn't exist. I think we got, I take that back, Arthur McWatt's Crusaders for Justice, which he worked very, Katie's husband, worked very hard on Crusaders for Justice, but even that had sort of an activism bend to it. So I'd love to embrace it all. and create that volume along with folks that are way more intelligent than me and have way more brain power. Bill Green, Christopher Lehman, Tina Coventry, I'm to Coventry Cohen's, Tina Burnside. The list goes on.
Yeah, thanks. So James, you've talked about stuff that you're working on or hope to do. Chad, your next book, do you want to say anything about that?
Sure, I could. So one of the things that I've been talking about since I've been here this week, and because I'm working on it, and I'll also discuss this somewhat tomorrow in a couple of events. I wrote Whiteness in Plain View and got a sense that there's a whole wide array of methods that whites use to do racial exclusion. And since then, as I started the project, Richard Rothstein's book, Color of Law, came out. And in that book, he really emphasizes heavily the way that the state is responsible for racial exclusion. And I don't want to sort of push back against that, or that kind of sort of provoked me to think, more about being explicit that that we can't put everything on the state, that the state isn't making white people do discrimination or do racism, that they rely on the state, that is local government, state government, federal government, to give them tools to do what they want to do. And when the government takes those tools away or modifies them, they just adapt and they evolve, right? So what that tells me to some extent is that there's something else going on there. And what I think I can sort of focus on is this idea of a culture of racial exclusion. So when I look at the way that culture matters in terms of enabling and sort of being sort of reliable for white people to do things like block African Americans from coming to their communities, or if they're there to remove them, or if they've accomplished that, then to maintain their communities as all white, like for instance the blackface minstrel shows. In Edina, there's an interracial farming village there in the 1970s, in the 19th century, and it's like truly interracial. People are like living together, working together, doing town government together, running the school system together, socializing together, and they would never have allowed a blackface minstrel show. You would never have seen that in Edina in the years up to the turn of the century. Once they start doing suburban housing developments there that are all white, exclusively all white, that's when you see the first blackface minstrel shows show up in the 1930s, and they last into at least the 1950s. And that tells me something. That tells me that this exclusion helped make and sustain a racist culture, but also that racist culture then helps continue to perpetuate the exclusion, makes it uncomfortable, even dangerous for Black people to be there, right? They don't want to be the way they were in the 19th century. So what I like to do is focus on blackface minstrel shows. And the other reason to do that is that so far that's mostly been treated as a 19th century topic. And I've seen overwhelming evidence that these things are going on like all the time, like literally all the time, all around Minnesota. And it's horrific, but again, it's one of those cases that's just, it's matched by a way in which white people have normalized it. If you hear them talk about it, hear them review the shows, or see the other versions, like big, the big glossy photographs of the shows, they don't question it. It's not occurring to them that these are in any way sort of questionable. And so that the normalcy gets us back to how we started this in terms of historical memory, right? In terms of what are the things that people are using to sort of do that misremembering or forgetting? And I think the culture of racial exclusion is part of that. Yeah.
We have a question from our favorite labor historian for James, and I don't, maybe Chad has some knowledge about this, but another Dakota County question. What roles did race and racism play in meatpacking unionism in South St. Paul?
Is this Peter?
Yes.
I have no clue. Meat packing. No clue. That even sounds more like Austin than it does Hastings, unless, is he aware of? Oh, I'm sure he is. Yeah, sorry. You probably know the answer and you're just putting me on the spot. So thanks, Peter. Sorry.
Okay, we have a little bit more time.
Thanks for wasting our time there, Peter.
No longer your favorite labor historian.
Right.
Is there a question that the two of you were dying to ask the other. Of course, nothing too personal, I guess, but I know you guys get to talk. But maybe a question that you want to ask that other people, what do you want to hear the other tell the rest of the audience, maybe?
Well, this is a little off track and I can thank Peter for this, but I think Mate One, I really loved that film, Chris Cooper, James Earl Jones. And if people don't know about Mate One, my friend here knows a little bit, but that's a powerful kind of story about, well, I'm not going to break it down, but if the audience is interested in tying in race and labor, I would defer to the movie Mate One, and if Chad wants to chime in with anything regarding it.
Do you know the spelling of that
Mate
title?
One,
Yeah.
Mate. Some people call it Matawan,
WAN, yeah.
WAN.
I mean, that's yeah, that's good to bring this up because I think for me, so I actually started, as I said, as a labor and environmental historian, and my first book was about Appalachia, the coal fields of Appalachia. So, and I worked in graduate school with Warren Van Tyne, who's the biographer of John Lewis, who's the head of the United Mine Workers Union. So when I was teaching classes, including labor history, I also often use Mate One because I think it's a pretty good movie as far as historical accuracy, and yet it's also entertaining, right? Like it's done, John Sayles does a great job of sort of like keeping up a momentum in terms of a narrative without sacrificing historical accuracy.
Totally.
And it sort of gets this idea, the potential or possibilities for bringing a very complicated history to the screen, right?
Yep.
And including the dynamics between, he sort of breaks it down into sort of three different groups of people: white, native-born, farm families who become coal miners, Italian immigrants, and African Americans who are coming up from the rural South, who would then are also the population of Appalachia for some time after that. So, was the question like what I think about the movie?
Well,
Or, I mean,
I just thought
in some ways it brings it back to you because like
right.
that's what
it's a model.
filmmakers can
It's
do.
a model,
Yeah,
I think.
but it relies on a lot of literature before we
Totally.
get to the point where you can make a film about it. John Sayles is like probably good at doing the research for his
Totally.
films, right?
Yeah, no, it was, as I said, it was a little off base, but at least it tied in labor and race to appease Peter's question. But I also knew that Chad had some research based on Mate One. Yeah, Chris Cooper, in fact, it's his first role.
Well, you know, and also like I said, I was thinking that the Whiteness there would be a documentary. So we did a sample reel. And the first time I met Peter in person, we went to his house and we did an interview. Peter Reckleff, who asked this question, James's favorite labor historian. And we asked him about, you know, the history of Austin. And he tells a story about when he went down to Austin in the middle of the 80s when the Hormel strike was happening. And he asked people, because he knew as a labor historian that the packing house workers union was actually well known for being an outspoken advocate of Black civil rights movement, that many packing houses were racially integrated because a lot of African Americans who were migrants from the rural South to the urban North getting jobs there. And that's why the packing house union is the kind of sort of socially minded, politically activist union that it is, because those Black workers demanded that the union do something about discrimination in the workplace and outside. Well, anyway, Peter says when he went down to, and he can correct me if he's still there, when he went down to Austin, he immediately asked the people, they said, well, where are the Black workers? Because there are no Black workers in Hormel in the 1980s, except there's probably two people who are students that were from Africa who had been students and were for some reason in the packing plant. But otherwise, there are no African Americans in the packing plant. And that's the beginning of him realizing what I started to also try to sort of investigate was like, why is Austin an all-white town, right? But for him as a labor historian, he knew that didn't make any sense, that a packing house, that Hormel that's involved in meat packing would be an all-white workplace. That didn't make any sense to him.
And American Dream, Barbara Koppel's documentary, worth seeing. Academy Award winning, if that matters to people. We went off on a
Okay.
yeah,
that's like we can really go on a tangent.
No, that's why we are here.
Yeah,
So
no, I think it's fun to tie, you know, docs and works of fiction and literature into the conversation as another supplement.
Well, one of the things that we are really about here is bringing in different kinds of media, different types of art and scholarship together to tell more accurate story about a more accurate narrative about the society we live in and how those different things are related and are part of the same conversation and tell the same story. So it's definitely not off. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of labor history here. So we're about at the end of our time. I know that both of you are very busy this week, and we appreciate that you were able to join us here for this. So greatly appreciated. Thank you. Hopefully we'll be having conversations more. I believe you're going to be here next summer at some point. Maybe we can encourage you to have another conversation, maybe on the work of the book that's coming up, and maybe you'll have more work done on another
Right.
documentary.
Maybe you'll have more work done. Thank you.
Yes, well,
You're
you'll
right.
definitely have more work done.
Yeah, you're right.
What
No,
the work will
I know.
be, and that's true for
Right.
me too. It's like, we'll see. Thank you everyone for joining us this evening. We have a very busy weekend with more events. I want to remind folks that we have some events in conjunction with the Southeast Asian Diaspora Organization. There is an event here at the library at from 6:30 to 8:30. Just welcoming sort of the series of events, very much focused around the legacies of war in Southeast Asia, and that linger on today. On the 12th, there is a panel discussion following the Kung Fu Zombies saga, Shaman Warrior versus Cannibals. It's at the Luminary Arts Center following the matinee production of that. And there are pay-as-you-will tickets available for that. So if you want to join us for that, that would be great. And then on Sunday, community conversation, storytelling, and art is activism. That will be at the Roseville Library in the community room. Go to our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org. You can find out more on our events page. Thank you again for joining us. And yes, we will see you soon.
Thank you.